This is the Defenders podcast on TV Podcast Industries. We're exploring Marvel 616, the documentary series on Disney Plus. We're talking about the second episode of season 1 of Marvel 616, Higher, Further, Faster. Welcome back, fellow Defenders. I really like saying that. We're back.
It's good, isn't it?
I know, yeah. We're back defending the Marvelverse and looking at the documentary series Marvel 616, season 1, episode 2, Higher, Further, Faster. We've already talked about episode 1 of the show, Japanese Spider-Man, which was good fun. But in preparation of returning to the Marvelverse after all this time away, we're talking about the documentary series Marvel 616 because we will be talking about WandaVision and all the new Marvel Disney Plus shows next month. And we wanted to talk about a bit of Marvel.
Next year.
Oh God, next year, yeah.
Not just next month.
January 2021, that's right. It does feel like it's only a week away till next year. So I suppose next month is appropriate as well. Thanks so much for joining us. We hope you've been enjoying watching the Marvel 616 documentary. If you haven't subscribed to the podcast, make sure you subscribe to us over at tvpodcastindustries.com. You can find us on any good or villainous podcast catcher, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Amazon Podcasts. We're available pretty much anywhere. Or you can find us over on our website at tvpodcastindustries.com. But let's have a chat about this episode, the second episode of Marvel 616, Higher, Further, Faster. This was the episode you were talking about before that was directed by Gillian Jacobs from Community. You were talking about that in the first episode.
Yeah, it was I think the whole 616 series was sort of outlined and promoted at the San Diego Comic-Con.
Yeah. And I remember her saying back then that effectively all the directors were coming to Marvel and Disney Plus with their ideas of what they wanted to deliver in their specific documentary. Kind of had an open carte blanche of what they wanted to cover. So this is the documentary that Gillian came up with. She wanted to have a look at what impact women have had over the years of Marvel, all the way back to the early days of Marvel. What kind of stood out to you about this episode, John?
Well, I mean, I think first off, this really is a brilliant look at women at Marvel, and the approach, in some cases trailblazing, to comics and stories of female representation over time.
Yeah.
It really is kind of basically saying that women are both compelling professional writers and have compelling stories to tell.
Yeah.
I think
it's really sad that you have to kind of point that out
exactly
in 2020, you know.
But I mean, it's even really, there's a really good quote from Nilah Magruder, and she talks about that there has been this move in writing from to mirrors instead of windows, that it's about seeing yourself in the story that you're telling rather than looking through a window at someone else and telling their story.
Yeah.
So that it becomes much more personal, much more insightful, and that, a lot of women through the time period, because this starts from 1940s and goes right up to the present day, but that a lot of women were writing women through that window, but it filtered also by society and a man's look at females. So they have no agency, or they're kind of like the housewife, and so it's very restrictive.
Like we always say about the superhero comics, where it's if there's a female in the storyline, it's the girlfriend or the sister or the daughter or something like that.
Yeah.
They're never the main character.
So and it's really sort of changing that over time. And I think what really comes out most of all that I found, and it was my impression that, when it starts off in the 1940s and it goes through to the present day, it's this journey through eras. But what was really interesting was that how heavily involved women were in writing and drawing and creating comics in the 1940s. They talk about World War II and the female labor force being mobilized, but there's this whole roll calls like Trina Robbins and just how, I think Tarp Mills as well, who actually created Miss Fury, all these comics, and even down to the point where the male-female readership of comics was 50-50. Mm-hmm. And you had this sudden crash in the 50s with the Comics Code where, like with video games, with movies, with TV, telephones, that, comics were going to rot the brains of children. And it's not to say, the slant suddenly became different because they were looking for the most profitable stream, and they said it was teenage boys that they focused on. And so all that golden age of superheroes, or the silver age, and it was all men being drawn for teenage boys. And it became to a point where it wasn't considered that girls should be reading comics. It wasn't what girls did. It was for boys. And yet, almost the decade earlier, from the 1940s, you hear all the women that on the documentary saying about how they would go down to their local shop and just, pick these comics and pick comics with women on the front cover. And it felt like there was an actual regressive step backwards, moving into the 50s.
Because it is one of those kind of self-fulfilling prophecies. If you say that at the time in the 40s that it was 50-50 readership, and then suddenly you only start producing comics for young boys and young boys written by men, then of course your readership starts turning towards 70, 80, 90%.
It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. But it was just fascinating, that contextualization, I think, that's brought out in this documentary. The other great little look is Maria Severin, and this was a penciler, a lady who did penciling in the 60s. I do like that they called the main hub of Marvel Comics in New York, the floor, it was called the Bullpen.
Yes, of course, the Bullpen. Yes.
Which is very masculine in and of itself.
Yeah, a little bit, but that's kind of what they used to call in the newsrooms. They would always have a bullpen. But I remember from the back pages of comic books, the letters pages always called bullpen bulletins. So you'd have a writer responding to you. I think that's what they were saying about Flo Steinberg, another one of the ladies featured in the documentary, that she was the one responding to all the letters that would come in from the kids. She'd respond in this really interesting Marvel voice. She would be the voice talking directly to their customers, effectively. So I love that she was there for so many years, and she's the one that people would hear back from if they talked to Marvel.
Flo Steinberg produced the Marvel voice in the correspondence pages, and Marie Severin, by pure happenstance, really got exposure where all of a sudden, I think it was in a magazine where she did drawings for the magazine.
Yes.
And it wasn't even Marvel. It was a weekly magazine on lifestyle. And all of a sudden, the editor in Marvel was like, she can draw, and it moved her to start drawing and leading on drawing, and to really make that name for herself in the industry. And I thought that was fascinating. Just glimpse into how, you hear some of her peers, some of her female colleagues saying she was never really into pushing, say, a female agenda. She just loved what she did. But by doing what she loved, she inspired and influenced and shaped all these women to come after her. They took inspiration from her. I thought that was a really great little look into Marie Severin. The documentary focuses very much on Sana Amanat and G. Willow Wilson through the creation of Miss Marvel.
I love that story. I really love the idea that, they're not finished creating new characters just because they created all these popular characters in the 60s, that there is a point that you need to start creating, as you say, the mirrors, the characters that people can see of themselves. We always talk about it, that there are characters that you latched on to as a kid, even though they didn't represent you. It's kind of the only thing that you're presented with. So you kind of go, okay, well, I guess my favorite hero is going to be Doctor Strange for you, or something like that, because I like the magic bit. I may not be anything like the character, but then when you do get presented with a character that mirrors yourself, you suddenly have a much greater attachment to that character than you would for anything else. And I think this story of Sana Amanat and G. Willow Wilson creating Miss Marvel, I think it's just this lovely idea of getting two creators who know the character backwards before writing a word on the page. They know exactly who this Miss Marvel is. So she comes fully formed out of their two minds combined.
Exactly. Both Muslim women, drawing on their experiences, at a time after 9/11 with, the anti-Muslim, anti-Islam sentiments, to create a Muslim, female American hero that is really just very fascinating. I mean, there's a great point with G. Willow Wilson where she says, "You're joking, aren't you?" And the cards are stacked against us already. We're just putting this on the periphery. And then she talks about when, the first press, second, and then the sixth press of Miss Marvel, and them going to Comic-Con and seeing how it's inspired cosplayers, girls dressing up, and the whole connected with Captain Marvel and the Carol Corps. Just so fascinating. I think, what's it, Kelly Sue DeConnick, who did Captain Marvel. She is another prominent figure here.
Yes, she is. I'd follow her on Twitter. She's fantastic.
Yeah, she is really amazing. And Louise Simonson and Annie Nocenti, really interesting Marvel women here talk about it. I think Annie Nocenti really has an interesting point that she makes about having, she was editing and doing the work on Daredevil, and she was talking about fighting and how, she took up martial arts so that she could, get the poses and understand fighting, because that's what happened. Yeah. And then it was this sort of step back where she said, but that's not how you always resolve something. Yeah. Looking at it from her view in a very different way. And Kelly Sue DeConnick saying the same thing, that a lot of women in literature, in comics, were seen as always against one another, fighting, to get ahead. And she tried to make it where they worked together. They still had differences of opinion, but they worked together to get ahead, you know. And I thought this was really fascinating. Along with Nilah Magruder, so she created, I actually hadn't heard of her before. She created an online comic, MFK, right? And had won an award for that out of the blue for new writer in comics. And she was brought on by Marvel as the first black writer, doing Tippy Toe and Rocket Raccoon crossover. Okay, and again, it was just fascinating hearing it. I mean, both her and Sana Amanat, they talked about, the society level, the family level, and also the personal level, of having to fight and break through, or things that held you back, So, I mean, on a society level, it's with that comics code. It's with it being a male-dominated industry, where they're dealing with that at that scale,
Well, absolutely. The comic code itself, it was probably just to mention it, Marvel broke away from the comics code in the 70s because they were sick of being told what they could and couldn't publish effectively. Not that they were doing, pornographic comics or anything of that sort. They just felt that the restrictions that were being put on them that made them only able to write books for 5-year-old kids meant that effectively, by the time the kids turned 10, they'd be turning away from the books, right? Because their books are only written for a certain age group. It's like the Beano and Dandy in Ireland and the UK. Yeah. You're writing it for an audience that is going to grow up, move on from them, because you're bound by this comics code. Marvel famously broke away from it because they wanted to do stories about things that would affect teenagers, drug addiction, that kind of stuff that was happening. And they wanted to tell those stories in their books. And now we're seeing this kind of rejuvenation of Marvel in a way. I work for a company that has a really great phrase that effectively talks about, by having diversity, you can only win. By having more knowledge available to you, you can only win. If you cut yourself off from diversity, you cut yourself off from ideas, which seems to be, and is great to see. That's also seems to be the Marvel way, where they have real people coming on board to tell their stories through Marvel Comics. It's a really inspiring episode, this one as well. I really enjoyed it.
It really is. Yeah. And, you know, hearing some of the family, sort of struggles, you know, you hear Nilah talking about how, you know, her parents, you know, the idea of being an artist and a comic book creator, rather than being an accountant and doing something like that, which I thought was really interesting. You know, all these different layers. And then you have Sana, who had supportive parents, but there was that almost that internal personal conflict. Like, she wanted to be a lawyer to change the way people, you know, for the better and change society for the better. And what she couldn't realize at that time was, or that she wouldn't know, is that she did that through comics by creating role models for young girls across all different races, and had this hero that they could identify with, not just maybe because she was Muslim, but certainly for a lot of Muslim people. There's a nice moment where they're looking at the correspondence, people from Pakistan, and from other Muslim countries around the world, but also that she, you know, the family dynamics of it, and the almost the introvertedness of Ms. Marvel, which relates back to Sana, remembering how she grew up.
And Miss Marvel is the Marvel fanboy. The character is the one that absolutely loves the Marvel superheroes, which is every comic book reader out there. So everybody has something to identify with Miss Marvel, which I love as well.
Yeah. So again, this is another one that is really inspiring. And I think, is a definite recommend, from myself. I think, you know, this includes a whole roll call of women involved in comics. And I think one of them says it themselves, you know, the history of comics has always been about Stan Lee or Jack Kirby, and these different male writers or artists. And, you know, you had a whole roll call, as I say, some I hadn't heard of, from Trina, Robbins, there's Louise Simonson, Hilda Terry, Violet Barkley, Franny Corrie, Zelda Ormer, Fran Hopper, Tart Mills, a whole range of different women involved at different times, really creating new stories, adding new characters that have connected with people through the different eras of comics, to inspire them to push those boundaries further, or to be that person pushing that boundary. So, a fantastic episode.
Higher, further, faster, John.
Exactly.
Yeah, really good job. Again, Gillian Jacobs, as the director of the episode, doing a really good job on the documentary. Really intrigued to see what she does in future, because this would have been her first kind of directorial debut.
I hadn't heard of her directing before. As I say, for me, she's Community. She's Britta from Community. Loved her. And yeah, it would be really interesting to see what comes next. I'm just intrigued,
because there's something that it really felt like she was telling an emotional story, but had so much available to her, because the story goes back to the 1940s. So there's a huge,
massive,
like 80 years of history condensed into this 1 hour of the show. I think it's one of the longest of the episodes, about an hour and 10 minutes, I think.
Yeah.
But that's a really good thing. That means she found her story and found what the tale she wanted to tell out of this history. So loads more there, and hopefully we'll get to see her do something else in the future, do some other kind of documentary in the future, or maybe, you never know, maybe she'll direct an episode or two of one of the Marvel Disney Plus shows. Is that it for this episode, John?
Absolutely. It's a recommend from me, and it's a great little documentary episode about the women of Marvel. Absolutely. Making new stories and new characters. Really, really good. So
excellent. So that's the kind of writing side. I think the next episode 3, is Amazing Artisans. That's a lot of artists working in Marvel. So we'll talk about that one next time. Thanks so much for joining us for this episode where we discussed Marvel 616, episode 2, Higher, Further, Faster.
Yes. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast over on the podcast catcher of your choice. You can head on over to tvpodcastindustries.com, or you can also support us by subscribing to our Patreon over at patreon.com/TV Podcast Industries. Remember, just another little shout out for WandaVision on January the 15th, 2021, where we will begin our coverage of the Marvel TV shows on Disney Plus.
Wanda Maximoff, Scarlet Witch.
Yes,
and
looks
Vision.
very Pleasantville. So it
At
should
times,
be, yeah.
it just looks weird at times. That trailer is fascinating, but really looking forward to that. Also looking forward to going on to the next episode of Marvel 616. If you want to share any of your thoughts about these episodes, or just let us know what you're thinking, email us to feedback@tvpodcastindustries.com. With that, we'll talk to you next time.
Yes, you can also join us over on our Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/TV Podcast Industries. And also over on Twitter, our handle for tweeting is at TV Pod Industries.
That's the one.
Yes. Thanks so much, fellow defenders, for joining us for episode 2, Higher, Further, Faster. Can't wait to delve in with our episode 3 titled Amazing Artisans. Remember, keep watching, keep listening, and keep defending.
Bye.
Bye.